There's something special about Super Metroid, a reason for why it has rightfully been cited as among the greatest games of our time. When you have something that dares to touch the elusive concept of perfection, and in the eyes of many, actually come to embody it, words fail to describe it. And yet, describe it we must. From beginning to end, the experience is seamless, continuous, free from interruptive tutorials, misplaced, long-winded narratives. Nearly everything is conveyed through pure gameplay, and yet it somehow manages to deliver a tragic story that can only be experienced through the act of playing the game for yourself. It is also almost solely responsible for creating not only the Metroidvania genre, but the entire cultural concept of speedrunning, and it does this by molding an exceptional gameplay experience that may never again be replicated due to the unique nature of its software engineering. Very few other games are in comparable positions from the 90s, and those that are come after Metroid. The story is subtle but impactful, the design a perfect balance of careful developer guidance and player agency. Samus herself is one of the best avatars of any game. She's responsive, mobile, and has almost too many intricacies to count. The atmosphere is dark and brooding when it needs to be, and it earns every triumphant moment it brings. It's a commentary on isolation, strength of will, resourcefulness, and contrasts both the beautiful and the horrific in thoughtful juxtapositions. Its introspective reflection on the human condition is elevated through the unique format of a digital game. Despite the limitations of the time, it is equal parts artistic and technically astounding. It's a landmark of what video games can achieve, and I wouldn't argue for anything less. Many other games are more overtly influential, but if I'm just looking at the greatest creation of video game artistry, the earliest example that does so in a completely flawless execution, for me, that honor has to go to Super Metroid. 27 years later, and here we are with Metroid Dread, or Metroid 5. People tend to cite it as a 19-year jump because of Metroid Fusion on the Game Boy Advance. But for me, Dread is the only other 2D Metroid game that stands any chance of measuring up to Super. I'll have more to say about Fusion and the original 2D games in a few moments, but suffice to say, Metroid Fusion lacks the kind of freedom games of this nature should aspire to have, and it creates a fundamental disconnect between the player and its exploration elements. I would not argue Fusion to be among the greats because it lacks a nuanced understanding of the cerebral catharsis that Super Metroid accomplishes so well. Despite its fans, Fusion severely misunderstands the key principle of a Metroidvania because it force-feeds constant dialogue exchanges, telling you exactly where to go and only giving the smallest dosage of freedom to discover that path forward. It treats you like a rat in a cage, and that's a bad thing because video games are the only art form that are not bound to linearity in the same way as other mediums. Dread is in an interesting position because it attempts to revitalize the Metroid formula that its Super Nintendo Classic achieved while simultaneously incorporating many of Fusion's ideas, and to good effect, I might add. The question, though, is whether or not Dread can properly find harmony between these two wildly contrasting styles, and perhaps more importantly, if Dread is able to develop a sense of identity independent of its history. If you've watched anything else of mine, no doubt you know that I'm not a big fan of open worlds because I find them tedious and boring. But Fusion creates an equally unenjoyable experience for leaning too far in the opposite direction, railroading the player from one upgrade to the next for nearly the entire runtime. There is a middle ground that gives players a measured dose of freedom while still preserving the thoughtfully curated narrative aesthetic moments I deem so necessary for a piece of art to be successful. Too much of one element does not inherently make it bad, but when you consider playing a video game, the key word in that is play, and the Metroidvania format is, and should be, a promise for uninterrupted play sessions of considerable length that virtually no other narrative-based game experience can provide. And yet, Metroid remains exceptional because the storylines are not reduced to abstraction or irrelevance. What they are is subtle. To say that Metroid Dread has a high bar to me is an understatement, but it's a powerful thing to see how Nintendo went all in on giving this game a formal red carpet rollout. We're talking about a 2D game with roots in a series that many people may not have even ever heard of. Dread represents the truth in devotion. Both the developers and publishers of this title have risen to the occasion to make this game something that can rival, if not surpass, its predecessor, which is quite commendable. Obviously, it's unlikely for Dread to be as influential as Super Metroid because it owes its design to its ancestor, But if I'm just looking at the execution of the design, we can weigh whether or not the advances in knowledge and technology have made for a better experience all the same. And so tonight, I'm doing my part by taking the time to uproot everything I can about Dread's design and appeal, and I'll be comparing it heavily with Super Metroid because that one is in the same series and is, as I feel, the most emblematic title of the genre. I will also be occasionally referencing Metroid Fusion and Metroid Prime. Fusion, as I said, because Dread retools many of Fusion's concepts in new ways, and Prime because though it is in 3D, its structure is incredibly similar to Super Metroid, so it may warrant a mention from time to time. Just so you're not left in suspense, I'll say this to begin. Metroid Dread does achieve the lofty goal of outclassing the past in more ways than one. The game runs like butter, is beautifully crafted, and perhaps most importantly has a keen understanding of what makes Metroid so rewarding. It is everything that, in my view, Breath of the Wild was not. A faithful reimagining of what those past games ought to have become. With that said, a faithful recreation is a compliment that only goes so far. At some point, the question of whether or not the reimagining can create the same lasting impression that its godmother did enters the equation. And to dethrone that, one must pave new, unexplored territory in profound ways. And that, I fear, is what Dread may not be able to withstand under scrutiny. The first thing you see when you boot up Metroid Dread is the title screen. And that's significant because there are no corporate logos, no mashing of the A button to get there. The experience immediately kicks into gear with a rendition of Super Metroid's menu screen music, along with a highly similar layout. This is one of those points I'm going to be saying a lot in this video, and that's because I want the developers to know that I noticed how much care they put into making this an authentic continuation. The music and the menu are indeed a nostalgic event, but I think its absence of logos demonstrates the degree to which Mercury Steam has taken this. Metroid games are all about atmosphere, and the decision to eliminate as many distractions from that as possible is enormously commendable. More developers should be this attentive. Once you've booted up the game, there is a brief summary of past events, mostly pertaining to Metroid Fusion. The theme matches the same one used in Super Metroid and blends into a cinematic introduction where we are presented with our key antagonist. From there, we are gently guided into the experience at large, though if you've seen any speedrunners, you'll know that it doesn't take long before some sequence breaking enters the mix. So we're off to a good start, but I want to touch upon the art direction here because it is the second thing you will take in after the opening. It would be unrealistic to expect Nintendo to employ a pixel art style, especially with a title that has so much pressure on it, and yet I can't shake the feeling that something has been lost along the way. To be perfectly clear, the art style they've chosen is good, very good in fact, but there's only so much that can be accomplished with it, especially when the task of reimagining pixelated aliens is on the line. The value of the pixel art style is that you're limited with the amount of information you can convey, and so inevitably the player has to use their imagination to fill in the gaps. The NES was particularly noteworthy for this, but that console demanded it, whereas the 16 bits found a fine mixture of both. The problem with the polished visuals of Dread is that they depict a three-dimensional space that you don't interact with three-dimensionally. By making the in-game world feel lifelike, your brain wants to project assumptions about how that world operates that simply will not prove true. Maybe this is more of a problem with me, but I can't help but feel I'm interacting in a 2D way simply because that's how the originals did it. And that's fine, but that doesn't absolve it from having to contest with the inherent contradiction. The best example I can think to describe this are silent films. You have silent films such as the film Sunrise, which severely limits the amount of title cards used because the filmmakers understood the medium as visual storytelling. And then you have the plethora of films that were silent but wish they didn't have to be, constantly interrupting the film to lean on another art form, that being literature, in order to convey exposition. And it's exposition that they ultimately should have done away with or found a visual way to communicate instead. And when you look at a film like The Artist, it is a love letter to the idea of the silent film more than the silent film era specifically, because many silent films, especially those made in the United States, heavily relied on title cards. A film like The Racket suffers greatly from this because it's trying to tell a Scorsese plot in a format that just can't handle that much dialogue nuance. The choice to create Metroid Dread in 2D is fine, in a sense, because we can acknowledge two-dimensional gaming as a valid use of the art form, just as we can acknowledge silent pictures as a type of art within the broader context of film. The problem is that Dread depicts its environments so that they appear 3D. Understanding that we interpret our own reality in that way, it would look weird if everything was flat, unless, of course, it was pixel art. Many of the backgrounds in Super Metroid are merely a pattern on repeat, but with good use of lighting, they create an unnerving or alien sensation. It does use black backgrounds as well, but there's a clear effort to use them sparingly and in such a way as to blend with the environment. You also just don't take something like a floating platform very seriously when it's 16 bits. All 16 bits can do is gesture, and so the criticism can't gain any meaningful traction. Dread's backgrounds strike a delicate balance between intricacy and mood without becoming overly busy. And there are a few moments of environmental storytelling, such as spotting a future boss, or after you open this valve and discover the opening area is flooded. I recognize that expecting the next 2D Metroid to be in a pixel art style isn't realistic, and I don't know that if I was a member at Nintendo that I would be pushing for it necessarily. But all the same, it's hard not to see the blocky shape of each room, and there are two things that I think give the geography its geometric feeling shape. Obviously, the thick black cubes for platforms are there to clearly communicate to the player what is and what isn't interactable, but they register as world absence to me, as if they are blocks of dark matter existing in some dimension outside of the game's world. The justification that the player needs to comprehend their environment doesn't change the situation either. It is unfortunate that having high-fidelity graphics demands some sort of solution to a problem that they themselves create, but that's what we have here. 16 bits is less detailed, so it's an easier image to take in. If I really wanted to, I could argue that this means we shouldn't go with a two-dimensional perspective, but we already have the Prime games, and all of this said, it's not that Dread looks bad. My point here is simply that Dread appears more gamey than Super Metroid because it fears a potential situation where the player can't intuit what they can and cannot do. Its graphics are so much more real that they have to resort to a few less than ideal visual design choices in order to compensate. Games like Hollow Knight demonstrate you can create a similarly all-encompassing mood that does not rely on pixel art. And again, Dread is, in my view, the best-looking Nintendo Switch game. Or at least it was up until the Metroid Prime remaster. In other words, the fundamental question I'm asking here is, were Dread to be created in a vacuum without the existence of side-scrolling platformers or other Metroid games, would Dread exist in a 2D dimensional space? I kinda doubt it. I think more realistically it would look more like Other M. And despite Other M's problems, the perspective I don't think anyone thinks was one of them. But the other issue is the excessive use of trailing platforms that seem to zigzag all about the room, giving the visual impression of being in a maze. You should feel like you're in a maze in a Metroid game, but the world should feel like an alien planet first. To its credit, the choppy lines are most prevalent in the Emmy zones, and this makes a lot of sense because that's when the fear is highest, when you will need a myriad of methods to dodge and slip through cracks and corners. And once the Emmy is killed, you can revisit the rooms hunting for secrets. The Emmy zones heighten the atmosphere with fog effects and less environmental clarity overall, and so the art direction gamified style ends up serving the gameplay best here. Art direction in games faces the challenging task of helping the player respond critically and emotionally to it. It does not have the option of being just window dressing. Despite the drawbacks here in the Emmy zones, the balance is struck as well as we might hope. Outside of them, Super Metroid still reigns supreme. The rooms feel more like natural environmental formations, like stepping through a living organism, a cave, a crashed ship. Dread's illusion is simply harder to pull off when the graphical fidelity is as high as it is, and the richness of the color palette makes the blacks so noticeably black as to feel like part of the game world we are supposed to ignore, which simply calls that much more attention to them. The goal is not to make the platforms ignorable, but rather completely unnoticeable in the first place. Something else I picked up on that I think is worth noting here is how Dread is very reluctant to have platforms exist without finding a way to link them to the outer walls of the room. Someone must have determined nearly on that all conceivable platforms must be visually connected in a web of Tetris geometry that frankly looks really bad when you pull your eyes back and simply look at the image. If we compare screenshots with Super Metroid and even Metroid Prime, the platforms in past games merge with their environment in a cohesive way. I suppose one could argue that Dread's philosophy is to subtly guide the player's sense of direction by having these black lines squirm around the rooms, And if so, I'm not sure why this is a problem for the art director rather than the level designer. There are, of course, plenty of spaces that are open and clean in Metroid Dread, but they are either too rare or merely an empty room for effect. The effect is nice, but you can't build enriching gameplay from it very well. And providing rooms that don't have the problem does break up the monotony, but doesn't get rid of the problem. In all, I just can't help but feel the visual style for Dread is a product of modern invention rather than a place I want to get truly lost in. I'm sure they must have tried to fill in these black beams with something more visually stimulating, and my guess is this made it difficult for players to determine what they could interact with, or perhaps maybe it was pushing technical limitations, but whatever the reason, it just falters a bit here. And if you don't think it has, go play the game again and see if you can tune out these black blocks now that I've pointed them out. While overall pleasing to the eye, the visual style also has a minor distracting hiccup that does alter the immersion. It's a subject I don't see anyone talk about, and I wager it's from the fact that people were simply happy to have another 2D Metroid game, which is fair enough. So let's talk about the map, the iconography, and the area distinctions next, as they are all interconnected, and in some ways are an extension of the art direction. Now, the map is largely legible and functional, and an overall improvement over Super, especially with the way it gives you a clue as to which area has a secret. It does not tell you the exact room or the exact spot in the room, but rather the room itself, which is much appreciated. However, it does have one annoying feature. When you move, you leave a trail of, we'll call it filled, squares on your mini-map, which is to mark the places you've been with the places you haven't. It sounds benign, because it is, but for me, I couldn't help but adopt this compulsion to cover the nooks and crannies of every room possible, even though logically I know this is functionally meaningless. I think it's self-explanatory why being driven to jump around every new room you enter like a jackrabbit is a bad thing, and while I recognize this is a tick on my end and was not something I needed to force myself to do, I just found the map somewhat hard to read without it, especially if I was trying to compare areas that I had explored thoroughly versus ones I rushed through. There are many instances when the game pushes you through an area without letting you stop to smell the roses, and a great deal more instances where it has you running through an area with multiple directions and points of interest that are inaccessible without more advanced equipment. Therefore, it becomes crucial for the player to realize that the game in its entirety is your sandbox. You cannot, for instance, clear an area of items, bosses, and secrets and move on to the next. Instead, you are encouraged to recognize that you'll be backtracking to each area an uncountable number of times, because while the first half has you gradually unlocking new areas and more of each of them as you progress, you eventually hit that point where the map and the endgame are yours, so to speak. This is reinforced by the fact that each area, while adhering to some thematic consistency, is never too distant from what another area may incorporate. For example, Ataria is mostly cavernous with some icy aquatic elements, but it has a small portion that includes the lava heat waves seen primarily in Kataris. This section is located fittingly right next to the Kataris transport. It even includes this semi-cinematic moment where the camera pulls back to give you a sense of imposing scale of what you're about to face. This would have fit fine as the first room you enter upon exiting the transport to Kataris, making it an immediate welcome highlight as your first new area unlock, and not one you are likely to revisit since the transports are somewhat outclassed by teleports later on. This problem, if you want to call it that, is more prevalent with water, which proves to be a recurring element in most areas. It takes a significantly long time before water ceases to become a hurdle, and as such, the developers utilize it more so as a mechanic to keep you out of areas that it wants you to revisit later, because those areas are harder or what have you. So why does this matter? Well, from a thematic point, you could say it hurts immersion because no element is given the kind of podium that you might find in an entry such as Metroid Prime. In Prime, the flow of the game is broken up into various areas, each with an extremely prominent aesthetic that is maintained for significant stretches of uninterrupted time. Backtracking is limited, so instead, Prime puts you through half of an area, typically concluding with an epic boss fight, before sending you off to a refreshing change of scenery in another area, and then the cycle repeats from the top. You visit each area once, go through each a second time, largely avoiding previously tread ground in favor of the new, and then you wrap. That covers most of the main game, excluding the Chozo key hunt at the end, which is a backtracking extravaganza, but it can largely be accomplished with one stroll through each area at the end, and what can't gives you a chance to enjoy your fully upgraded character for about the hour that it takes to do it. And I do mean an hour. Metroid Prime's scavenger hunt is really not as bad as everyone says. Prime is the more overtly obvious example, but Super Metroid handles this well also. Even though you have caves in Criteria and Norfair, they look visually very different, and the inclusion of places like the wrecked ship are sensibly positioned within the rainforest scenery to make for a similarly green-themed complement. Essentially a bump in tension aesthetically, but not in a way that is too far removed from where we were. Brinstar is the only outlier here, put together with 3 or even 4 biomes that don't play nice together. My biggest critique of Super Metroid is this door right here, which sees you transition from what's clearly an overgrown jungle into a snowfield. The change is so drastic and there's nothing to help justify it. This blunder aside though, it's still better than Dread because at least in Super all the inconsistencies are condensed into Brinstar, giving Brinstar a unique visual look, albeit a strangely inconsistent one. The contrast here is that the areas in Dread bleed into each other constantly, that they fail to maintain an identity of their own. Some hold up better than others. Burinia, for example, takes its water segments into total submergence, while Kataris favors lava rooms on the whole. There is an important distinction to be made here because sometimes the aesthetic background is merely a background, while in other cases it is a mechanical obstacle. Gavorian's jungle aesthetic doesn't exactly scream jungle in its gameplay, nor do these hurdles necessitate a forested environment, for example. The plant platforms that pop in and out, for example, could have had any number of in-world reasons for their functionality. It doesn't need to be a plant for this room to operate in the way that it does. And that's fine. Super Metroid didn't exactly stick to its themes perfectly either, with Brinstar, as I mentioned, definitely being the most erratically diverse example. You could also argue that Metroid Prime didn't add enough variety to its biomes, preferring a standard fare of a fire level, an ice level, and a desert level, and so on. But at least Magmor, Phendrana, and the Chozo Ruins have identities that justify lengthy transports between different continents of the planet. It also helps when these areas combine elements such as the Space Pirate Research Laboratories in Phendrana and the Chozo Ruins in the desert. Somehow, when I mention Brinstar, Norfair, or Meridia, I remember them. Brinstar is a strange, snowy jungle, Norfair is full of lava and heat waves, and Meridia is a swampy, icy, or underwater entirely. Kataris, Burinia, Gavorian, and Phrenia are the most distinct areas in Dread, which, to be fair, is the majority of the game. But everywhere else kind of meshes together, and even these are not always sacred. In thinking of specific rooms, you're very likely to mix them up with where they belong on the map. I'll go ahead and post up some stills of random images. I suppose if you know Dread well, you'll be able to guess where they are from. But if you only played it once or twice, or even if it takes a few seconds longer to figure out where it's from, I think it's obvious there's a lack of identity for each area. And when you compare with Super Metroid, it really only has one possible location to be associated with. The other, possibly more important problem though, is that the areas in Dread don't connect in a thematically rich way. The example of the lava tunnel I mentioned is good, but not great. And comparing the two stages of Norfair from Super Metroid should clarify what I mean. The first half of Norfair is a heat zone with lava, but is otherwise an alien biome. When you descend to the second level near the end of the game, however, that is when you see the Chozo Ruins. By being forced to traverse the environment for a long stretch of uninterrupted play, the area establishes a thematic identity. Upper Norfair is a heat zone filled with hostile alien life and death pits, but is otherwise uninhabited. Lower Norfair, on the other hand, is a final proving ground before the last conflict, essentially deepening the hostile lava biome from above. The ruins are in a far more damaged and crumbling state. The lava has a new tier and appearance, literally upping the tension by raising the temperature even more. And the enemy types are some of the most dangerous in the game. We even start to see the Space Pirate Laboratories, which is good because it serves a greater role in transitioning us into the final area, which is where you'll be heading immediately after here. When Metroid Prime broke up its areas, it did so in very harsh dividing lines. This is the snow area, this is the lava area, this is the rainforest, etc. But as I said before, there's usually another element that layers this. And we can argue Prime is a little more one note, but Prime puts great effort to make it seem like you're traversing hundreds if not thousands of miles across the planet to different sectors. And Dread is just weak on all of this. The discovery of a loom is a rare highlight because it's a climactic point to shift into the third act. It being a small area grounds the focus of its aesthetic into the single ancient Chozo sanctuary that we see. That said, you obviously can't have areas this small too often because they would make the world feel shallow. But the range of variety per area could have and should have been smoother, both to help a player memory, but also so that it's theatrically significant. Instead, what we have here is one step shy of a free-for-all in terms of what aesthetics are used where. Transports in Metroid are the equivalent to a chapter break in a novel. A chapter break is a more potent extension of a scene break, just as a scene break is more potent than a paragraph break, and a paragraph break is more potent than a period, and so on. From a design perspective, transports in Metroid, I would imagine, are used to give the game time to change its assets. If an enemy is only present in one area, it will need time to load in that asset and ditch the ones it no longer needs. I could be completely wrong on this, but I'd wager that's why the game needs to be broken up in the way that it is. Regardless, from the player's point of view, there is also a purpose. It gives them time to mentally process their experience thus far. As previously mentioned, most of a good Metroid game has long stretches of uninterrupted gameplay. Left to their own whims, a player will keep playing so long as they are having fun. That's a good thing, but a few brief and carefully orchestrated pauses can and do enhance that experience because they give your brain a moment to breathe and absorb. My point with all this is that Dread uses transports, elevators, and teleporters, and all of them accomplish the same goal, more or less, but they also add unnecessary complexity. The teleporters are the one that's more in line with a conventional science fiction aesthetic to provide players convenience and probably my least preferred as a result. A transport or an elevator, on the other hand, creates a stronger sense of a separation between biome and is more emotionally impactful because it's relatable. In real life, transportation takes time. Sitting on a bus, driving a car, even flying a plane. Nothing is instantaneous. Transports and elevators are more grounded concepts that have an easy real-life comparison to attribute. But teleports deviate too much from this. You basically enter some kind of either cyberspace and then materialize elsewhere, and there is no real-life equivalent I can think of to apply to this, and so they essentially betray our understanding of how reality works. I don't need a justification for a laser bolt disintegrating an alien because all that already exists in the real world, if only on a different scale. We know what a gun is, not that a bow and arrow. We know what an explosion is. We have gunpowder and chemistry class volcanoes. They are more justifiable in Dread where the biomes have less of an encompassing identity, but that merely highlights my other problem. I like my biomes as cohesive scenes in the larger motions of the journey. When they mix aesthetics, it's more difficult to build a sensible conclusion as to the thematic importance of each motion because they fail to stand on their own 2 feet, as adding something uniquely significant to the whole picture. In other words, if lava can be experienced in multiple places, it means lava does not meaningfully create an atmosphere for a location. Instead of making the area rich, it's just serving a mechanical function across what now appears to be seemingly arbitrary instances. Transportation means change. There must be an importance on creating an ebb and flow with different energies. Metroidvania is an excellent format for this and is a key way in which these games alter player moods and provide justifications for different types of enemies, challenges, and lore. Dread is just inferior here because it treads on boundaries when it should not. A desert does not spontaneously become a snow-covered mountain in real life, so it shouldn't be that way elsewhere. I know people like to give Metroid Prime crap for having aesthetically conventional choices for its biomes, but I would say you're not giving enough credit to the blend of aesthetics each area holds, such as the space pirate hideouts, the Chozo ruins, the drowned frigate. These sub-biomes break up the visuals and keep the area fresh. They do this as a further development of an idea, not an abandonment of their train of thought for the sake of variety. The execution of these areas is also borderline oppressively enveloping for a good stretch of time, such that you get just enough time to fully get lost in an area, but also not so much time that you get bored. In Dread, it feels like every other ability requires you to backtrack to a different area and pick something up, and that to me brings the sensation of backtracking to the forefront of my brain. I haven't had enough time to explore the space I was in yet, so it feels like you're being rushed. It also conditions you to think that your next objective could literally be anywhere. In Super Metroid, you really only visit Upper Norfair once, Wrecked Ship once, Meridia once, Lower Norfair once. While you may leave to hunt for secrets, you really don't have to. Even Upper Norfair, which requires you to leave to pick up power bombs, can easily be circumvented with a little skill and some prior knowledge. Put in a more accommodating light, in Dread, it sort of treats the entire planet as one enormous sandbox. But feeling like I have the whole planet at my fingertips makes the planet feel much, much smaller than it would otherwise. If each biome is not fully committed to a pronounced thematic image, and the game has you bouncing back and forth between multiple biomes on the regular, you can see where the individual areas are not leaving a memorable impression, which in turn hurts the immersion. Now, I will say Metroid Dread is definitely longer than Super Metroid, and because it relies on the entire map, it does manage to accomplish a new sensation. Now, this is not to say that each biome is available immediately, but it does dole them out at regular intervals such that there is still a refresh to the game world, making for good pacing. And the uniqueness here is that you can feel a little overwhelmed. Each area is actually fairly small, but since whenever you consult the map to figure out where to go, you might actually check the biome you are in, and then branch out into the global perspective and realize that there's a whole range of ideas that are potential avenues to explore. Most of these will simply lead to a small secret, an upgrade pack, or some such, but the fact that the game makes you stop and question yourself and that it prevents a nightmare situation in which all of these options are valid means the world of Dread sort of pulsates from being incredibly large to manageably small throughout the playthrough. This is great design, and definitely something that would not have been realistic to achieve with 16 bits back in 1994. I confronted Kraid once or twice during this run before I decided to acquire the bomb upgrade in advance. There is a hint in the boss fight that gives the player a clue about potentially sequence breaking, and this struck me as an example of the game trying to break outside of the mold of its predecessors. Sequence breaking is, of course, the ability to acquire power-ups before the conventional route would allow. Generally, it means pulling off a stunt of some kind, and I think it was a sensible move for Dread to give a player the clue that this can be done. They specifically chose it for a pretty tough boss, so not only does it happen in a place where you are very likely to notice, it happens during a challenging part of the game. If you can't beat Kraid, you might just decide to hunt for a way to get an extra tool or two that then pave the way for more health and ammo. And since the whole planet is at your fingertips, this is a sensible thing for the player to intuit while remaining a unique difference from its predecessors. This uniqueness was short-lived, however. I managed to get not only the bombs and the grapple beam, but also the flash shift ability before I ventured back to Kraid. And this provided me with a reminder of why Dread, despite its strengths, did not resonate as strongly as it could. It was in this moment, this hour or so, that I felt the game had shut up for good, and I was free to check my map, plan my routes, and get into all sorts of trouble. I went to the bottom of the ocean, diving headfirst into dangerous depths, made some discoveries, mapped the areas, and had to claw my way back out, through harrowing encounters with foes far and above my capabilities. And that was great. It stressed me out to be at low health in hostile places that were more challenging to traverse because I was lacking the expected equipment for it. But that's what made it sink into my memory and appreciate the design. The question was, how often would this sensation of survival permeate throughout the rest of the game? The answer? Not enough for the Metroidvania purist. While energy tanks have made their return in usual form, they also have versions that are broken into 4 pieces, sort of like heart containers and heart pieces from Zelda. Missiles are a little different though. In the past, missiles were typically doled out in packs of 5. In Dread, they exist in packs of 2, but there are now Missile Plus packs of 10. My only guess as to why this is split up in the way that it is was to create more variance in player excitement when you find an upgrade pack. Notably, the Missile Plus packs tended to be in plain view, although some of them are just lying around like candy. But mostly they required a somewhat more challenging Shine Spark puzzle to pull off. I guess that's a fine reward, but it added an extra layer of complexity that just didn't feel like a meaningful change. In my mind, a bigger and better upgrade will always be the energy tank since those are more rare. These upgrades start to become excessive, and I have since beaten the game on hard twice with less than 100 missiles in my total. Why did I do this twice? Well, because about 2 hours worth of footage got corrupted, and naturally this footage was the endgame, so I had to play through it all over again. So let's try an experiment. The number of secrets to find is good, but what you end up with in the end is excessive to say the least. If we replace all the Missile Plus packs, of which there is 11, with regular missile expansions, effectively you would have 88 missiles unaccounted for, bringing our total available missile count down from 275 to 287. Now, obviously, we wouldn't want to have such an awkward number to end on, but we could cut back on our starting missile count and fudge things around a little until we get to 200, which I'd say is more than fair. We should also cut back on item upgrades that are just sitting around on the floor. I get it's a subtle way to tell the player where to go, but the only reason they have a problem figuring out where to go is you failing to properly section off areas. You're the one that has us running around the whole planet from the moment we get a distress signal. But okay, so we're here now. I still think there are multiple instances of items that too overtly tell us where to go, and if we can cut a few, we can target the energy parts as well. There are 16 of them in total, adding up to 4 energy tanks. Whether we want to average things out and make each energy tank worth half or a third or 1 or what have you, my point is we have options. We haven't even touched on the power bombs yet either. Now I might be off in the exact numbers, but the issue still stands. And you don't want to cut back too much because you can't assume new players will be able to find enough upgrades by the end. But I think we can all agree that 275 missiles is far too generous. In fact, I think a missed opportunity for hard mode could have been to cut down on how many missiles you get from each pack in half, making for a grand total of 100, which, as I've proven, can be done twice over. This is kind of overthinking things, but I think the missiles get trapped in this nebulous space where instead of having them be useful but limited part of your arsenal, they become a nearly infinite supply. Let's not forget that you can get a refill whenever you successfully parry an enemy, including bosses, and I actually liked the tension that this brought. You can only do so much heavy damage until you need to manage the best you can until the proper time for a counter. This added more tension and more excitement to many of the boss encounters, especially on that harder difficulty. And also, let's not forget that your fully upgraded beam and charge beam are powerful enough to keep up with most any boss you encounter, so less would have been more in this case. There are also ammo recharge stations at relatively accessible walking distance. You can parry, you can tap an amiibo for a quick refill. There is more than enough here. Super Metroid has a cap of 230 regular missiles and 50 super missiles. And believe it or not, by the time you near those totals, the last major boss fight, Ridley, can literally take all of that punishment and still keep up in the fight. Why? Because Ridley was designed to handle it. And I don't just mean his health pool. Ridley does not die when his health is depleted. Instead, he lunges at you a dozen times for a grab. If he gets you, then he dies. If he misses, the fight continues and you have to avoid more of his attacks. In short, there was a failsafe put in place so that this boss is still challenging even if you get the maximum amount of ammo possible. And I just don't see that from any of the bosses here in Dread. Let's circle back around to those refill stations. Just from examining the map, 9 times out of 10, there would be an ammo, health, or both stations within very close proximity to a save station, which makes their placement a little wasteful. Save stations could double as health and ammo refills. The game already utilizes an autosave function every time you enter an EMI zone, among many other instances of autosaving. Now, EMI autosaving is appreciated since you are more than likely going to need multiple attempts to get through them. And being sent back to a previous save, even though health and ammo are irrelevant when it comes to EMI encounters, would have gotten very annoying very quickly. So I'd say they mostly made the right call there. I think personally I would have checkpoints be an optional choice in the main menu, and I also would strategically place the save stations near EMI zones, sometimes right outside if it's a particularly difficult run, but others would make you walk a bit in order to enhance the tension. The checkpoints are definitely too excessive otherwise, and they exist even on hard mode, which I found really baffling. In this game, the save station is literally only important if you intend to stop playing. Otherwise, the game continuously moves forward. It wasn't tremendously intrusive, and with a longer game, the importance of replaying content verbatim does have its valid downsides. In my aforementioned playthrough, I ended up not using the recharge stations at all because I found it was easy enough to perform a parry or two to refill. Speaking of the parry system, it works, and is a bit of flashy goodness to mix things up. but it's part of a somewhat larger issue concerning damage. For an RPG, each level gain you receive should statistically outclass what you were before. But in a Metroid game, you should grow horizontally more than vertically. By that I mean the upgrades you acquire allow you a greater range of options in terms of combat and traversal. In other words, you might gain new beam upgrades, but they should offer some functionality beyond just being a damage boost. This is what makes the wave and ice beams from Super Metroid memorable. You don't need them necessarily, but they added variety and versatility to the experience and could even be used to solve puzzles. Eventually, you do get a stronger beam in the form of the plasma gun, but this is granted as a turning point. It allows the game to offer up more powerful enemies, and by trivializing past enemies, it pushes previous areas into being more exploration-focused. A similar structure is found in Dread, most notably when you acquire the screw attack. It's a good thing this is held back until the very end because it turns nearly every enemy into a complete joke. The upside to this is that you've essentially beaten the game. You've proven yourself, so Screw Attack allows you to revisit past areas to hunt for items without being pestered by enemies too much, just like how it works in Super Metroid. It sort of changes the focus of the experience, and I do think it's a little overly strong, but it didn't seem to be much help in boss fights, so I guess it's fine. As an aside, this is something I don't feel is a fair criticism lobbied at Metroid Prime. The final run to collect all the Chozo keys is its own version of retreading through the game once more at a much faster pace, and gives the player a sense of empowerment when they recognize they have come so far. It's not backtracking so much as sleuthing through areas with a different objective in mind. We drive the same roads everywhere, but we don't always drive them for the same reasons, and the reasons we are there fundamentally changes how we feel to cover that distance. And all decent Metroid games give you this session of revision. If you're driving to work or driving to a family Christmas party, it's a very different vibe in the car along the way. Dread has a particularly interesting ace up its sleeve in terms of difficulty though. There is a mid-game difficulty spike with the inclusion of the X-Parasites, which create more deadly versions of the enemies you've been facing. I like this organic way of bumping up the challenge, and the beam upgrades are a decent secondary stepping stone to this. They specifically improve upon options with the wide beam giving you greater coverage, the plasma beam allowing you to damage machines, and the wave beam passing through targets and walls. This is all in addition to the damage bonuses they provide, which if anything don't go far enough. There are way too many enemies that die in a single parry, but otherwise take hundreds of blaster fire. I get the parry is a more difficult action to perform, but it's not that difficult, and the incentive is borderline enough to have you simply stand around and wait for your chance rather than just mash the button and try to shoot them to death. And by the way, why is the wide beam not just called Spazer? That's what it is. I mean, talk about resorting to an uninspired name when you already have one you can use. Like with Super, beam upgrades should be equally focused on providing functionality as well as damage. The wide beam, for instance, allows you to propel certain blocks out of the way. You can imagine how this can be used to solve something really intricate, but its use is almost exclusively to unlock new areas. This carries over to the other beams where certain doors cannot be opened until you progressed far enough to have discovered them. This is done so that the player is ultimately never lost. You'll feel lost because you're routinely changing areas and attempting to reach places where you can't, but eventually, after you exhaust all possibilities, you're left with the only correct course to take. And that's not a bad thing. You get an item or ability, and then you use that equipment to chip away at your environment until you find the crack in the wall that you can slip through. Rinse and repeat. But it's important to stress what it is not. It is not used for deeply elaborate puzzles because there aren't any. And it is not intended to be used in tandem with your other abilities. I'm thinking of games like Ori where you reach a point where you are using your abilities to tackle harder environments because of the way they can synchronize. Then you have games like Zelda where maybe you use the Eye of Truth to see hidden blocks, while simultaneously using the hover boots to cross gaps between those blocks. Or even Metroid itself, which you compare items like the Ice Beam to freeze enemies and the high jump boots to jump and land on them. Zelda is very much an adventure game though, because the abilities you gain are locked in a menu screen. In a Metroidvania, your avatar is filling in button slots with new abilities all the time, so in theory, you never need to pause. Even when Zelda has a particularly extensive puzzle, usually it's something like moving blocks around until they fall into the correct position. It often has more to do with your cognitive reasoning and less to do with your character's actual abilities. The abilities are simply a threshold, a way of communicating to the game that you've beaten World 1-4 or whatnot. But I was a bit disappointed to find that I never had to do anything completely crazy, like speed boost over a crumbling gap to blast a 3-point block with a wide beam, and then leap off of that block and spider stick myself to the wall that then descends so that you can grapple yank a cube to slip through via morph ball. Okay, maybe that's going a bit too far, but you get my point. A room with 6 or so blocks you can shift around in various ways until you create a staircase to the top. That could have been cool, but I also see the idea that maybe that would have pushed it too much like Zelda and slowed the pace down to a crawl. It doesn't have these kinds of puzzles because rooms never reset. I wondered if the Emmy zones would be used for this kind of design experimentation, but they are very clearly set up as obstacle course haunted houses. After the Emmys are defeated, they brighten up a little and the music makes you feel like you're concentrating hard on something. But what exactly am I concentrating on? In that creating a staircase example would have fit nicely in one of these defeated Emmy zones, but instead you're ushered along before that can really happen. On my first playthrough, I kept attempting to revisit areas I'd been to after I had acquired a couple of upgrades, but I was frequently yet gently nudged back into proceeding through the main course of the game. You can do a bit of exploring here and there, like if you want to go back 1 or 2 rooms. There are secrets to be found, but it's really not necessary, in part because you get far too much from each upgrade. It sounds linear and a bit railroady, and that's because it is. In principle, this really isn't all that dissimilar from Super Metroid because the challenge of the game is not in carving out your own path, but rather in finding those cracks that allow you to inch your progress forward. There's no wasted time in an area because you aren't meant to spend an exaggerated amount of time there. Instead of intense reflexes, mostly what you're exercising your brain to do is comprehend the spaces you are in a more nuanced way. You're looking for ways you can use your new tech to break down the barriers keeping you from having full reign over the experience. Sort of an anti-open world, if you will. That's the spirit of a Metroid game, and Dread mostly understands this. I say mostly because Super Metroid simply has a greater range of how much you can jumble the order of events. It's entirely possible to beat the 4 main bosses in reverse order. I get that it's a shorter game, but it's only somewhat shorter, by about an hour or 2. So that's a degree of sequence breaking that elevates Super Metroid into classic status. Dread really does not seem to allow a comparable amount of sequence breaking. There's some, but not enough meaningful sequence breaking. It always felt like a sequence break that the developer approved of, rather than something that was accidentally left open and is a massive risk for the player to tackle. While this next point is true of both games, Super is shorter and has less of them, so their impact is buffered considerably. Some, in fact many, of the abilities in Dread are glorified keycards. This was most notable with the grapple beam. In one puzzle, you're expected to grapple across a gap for a missile pack, but it's much easier and simpler to just flash shift your way across. Even easier if you have space jump. On the one hand, this trivializes the grapple beam, in many cases leaving you to feel like it's a wasted upgrade. True, it's a stepping stone before space jump, but at least in Super Metroid they make you put the grapple beam through its paces before then. I think we all remember the sequence leading up to the Dragon fight in which the grapple beam is all but essential to get there. There is a moment where the backtracking is brilliantly executed in Super Metroid because it's tumultuous to get through the first time, but when you backtrack with space jump, it's a night and day difference, and it helps you feel powerful because it provides you with contrasting experiences. Here, you can't even extend the beam very far, even though it clearly has more reach than it's letting up. Also, the hitboxes are very specific to the point where any opportunity to not use the grapple beam is welcome. You basically use it to remove blocks and open doors, and that's not any different than what the plasma or the wide beam already does in the end. You have to wonder how obligatory it was. You get the grapple beam and immediately use it to climb out of this pit, so naturally you're feeling like it's going to be pretty useful. But it's not really, and I think I'd have been okay with it being cut if there isn't a strong enough justification to see its usefulness play out. I'd say the same thing about the spin jump. All it is a lesser space jump, but instead of fragmenting out all the abilities, just give me the space jump, and then build environments that account for when I will and won't have space jump. A similar event occurs with the gravity suit. You have to traverse basically all the underwater areas without it, And then once you have it, the underwater sequences are all but behind you, effectively negating the point of the upgrade entirely. As far as other aspects of the gameplay are concerned, I'm not a huge fan of the omnidirectional aiming, and I'm mixed on the melee attack. Both of these elements are carried over from the 3DS Return of Samus remake, which was in some sense a proof of concept to Nintendo that Mercury's team could handle a brand new mainline Metroid entry that would serve an important role in getting Metroid back into public discourse before the release of Prime 4, and also to help them sell Switch OLEDs. Regardless of the exact plans, greenlighting Dread is a very different decision than a fairly safe remake that comes with a blueprint, appeals largely to returning fans, and is being sold on a popular if dying console where the sales aren't all that important. And they pulled it off, at the very least to satisfy Nintendo to give Dread a green light. To their credit, they are both intuitive additions. I don't have major qualms with the omnidirectional aiming other than that it has the adverse effect to force Samus to stand still. In Super Metroid, you could run, aim at a 90-degree angle, and shoot all at the same time, and despite what some people say nowadays, it wasn't all that hard to perform, especially since you couldn't button map your controls however you wanted. The trade-off in Dread is that you can angle your aim without locking yourself in place just by adjusting the analog stick. And you can even do this while moving, and in these instances, it's smooth. It's just a small bump. I couldn't help but notice those instances in which I needed to stand still and aim at an angle because the spaces are so large and analog is so loose. Then you have to be precise. In Super, I'd press one button and be locked in for the shot with free mobility. It's snappy and efficient. Here, you lock into place, and it just feels a little awkward. Sometimes you're locked into place in Super Metroid as well, but that's when you're crouched. And this small detail of making the character go into a different position, one that we as humans know you can't immediately get up and run from, does create a more tactile sensation, whereas Dread is simply putting in an arbitrary condition for why you cannot move. It may be a necessary change, but remember that it is only necessary because the space is so huge and you are so small. It might have been interesting to see if a snap angle shot was possible, and if so, why not make it something to toggle in the options menu? At any rate, Super Metroid simply feels more up close and intimate, revitalizing the point that just because you can make something bigger doesn't always make it better. As for the melee, I think it suits Dread's pace well. Combined with the slide mechanic, this is a much more energized and agile interpretation of Samus that's refreshing. One of my biggest compliments of Super Metroid is how comprehensive Samus is to control. The Samus in Dread mostly lives up to that enormous expectation and could potentially surpass her in time, but I would be remiss to think that the melee attack only gives her another option. Melee is essential, and introducing a mechanic that dominates the gameplay loop is a risky move. I say essential because melee often outright kills enemies and also grants greater health and ammo pickups. In comparing how long it takes to kill enemies with your gun, and it's clear melee, especially parry, has been made a very, very high priority. As I mentioned though, the melee is seamlessly blended with movement. You can stop in your tracks and wait for a counterattack, but you can also just plow forward, and it's the second method that keeps the player moving, which is another hallmark of this sort of design. And this is where I don't want to make it sound like I want Zelda-style puzzles of shifting blocks around too much, because that is very much a Zelda thing. Metroid needs good game feels. It's nice to see that that took priority over puzzle concepts, I'd say. I do think the one challenge it does introduce is making sure the enemies remain a challenge when needed. Obviously, there are always pushover enemies, but Dread seems to take the contrast of lightweights and heavyweights more seriously than past games. Especially by the end game, there are virtually no mid-tier enemies, and I think if they are to develop a sequel, this hole should be filled. The obvious choice is to bring back the Space Pirates, but the choice this time was the inclusion of the Emmy. It's taken me a while, but we're finally here. We absolutely cannot overlook the Emmy stealth sequences because they're a major highlight and the unexpected addition Dread brings to the table. This is important to stress. It is not a remake or a remaster. It is a new entry, and therefore there needs to be a justification to exist, and to be a factor of consideration among its peers. This balance is very difficult to strike, but I'm happy to say that the Emmy sequences are a great addition to the game, and nicely add to the mythos of the Metroid universe as well. The Emmy are trapped within specifically sectioned off zones, and within these zones, it's player versus Emmy and no other. Typically, you have to pass through the Emmy zones a few times before you are able to identify the source, which will charge your arm cannon with energy capable of actually killing the Terminator-esque machine. The way that you kill them is scripted, but only in that you have to find a long enough runway to have enough time to destroy the enemy's plate armor, and then repeat with a charge shot to take it out for good. Any contact with an enemy before or after this point is instant death. Sort of. The enemy don't want you killed, they want you captured. The purpose is initially unknown, but that only adds to the mystery. You can counterattack an enemy, but the timing is extremely precise, making it a risky proposition you don't want to be forced to take. If you manage to counterattack, however, you'll get a rush like no other. Essentially, the enemy are something of a mini speedrun because you have to be fast, but you also have to avoid situations that slow you down, in this case, outright set you back. The best part of the enemy is that they dramatically shift the flow of the game for a brief time. You can clearly see the doorway to an enemy zone, giving you a moment to collect your breath. The tension is high because the game cuts out a number of mechanics entirely. The amount of health and missile upgrades you have is irrelevant. The number of power-ups you have is irrelevant. Your combat skills are irrelevant. And this basically reminds the player that there are vulnerabilities to their character. During most overworld exploration, combat with enemies is kept to a minimum. Some flying stingray bats are not the kind of threat any player will or even should take seriously. It is sobering to have breaks from the quiet contemplative exploration as well from action-heavy boss fights, do something that is both a natural fit for a Metroid game and a fresh type of gameplay all the same. If you're the kind of person who ever felt that Metroid games are boring, first off, shame on you, but secondly, Dread is a great entry point because it has so much variety. The enemy are a much more unique and thrill-filled inclusion that represents a loose inspiration from Metroid Fusion on the Game Boy Advance. It would be fair to compare Metroid exclusively with Metroid Fusion since they share many commonalities that Super Metroid and Prime do not. Fusion and Dread lead more in the horror direction than any other. They both feature at least one impervious entity that hunts the player throughout the game. They both have the AI companion Adam to relay story and world information to them. And they both involve the X-Parasite instead of traditional Metroids. I've not spoken about it much until now because Metroid Fusion is not an entry I hold in high regard, which I'm sure is obvious based on how little I've spoken about it. As a game, it has its moments, but as a Metroid title, it fundamentally misunderstands the entire purpose of the genre because you're told exactly where to go and what to do for nearly the entire game. This baffling decision ruins literally everything else about it. That rat in a maze feeling is terrible, except not only is it not really a maze since there's only one path to go forward, but there are giant flashing billboards signaling every turn. It's maddening. Metroid Fusion is a poorly thought out Metroidvania, and I'm genuinely curious to understand why people rank it so highly, other than the fact that it has good atmosphere for a Game Boy Advance game. There are a few sequences where the relentlessness hand-holding does finally let up near the end, as well as some genuinely surreal moments, such as the one boss that takes place in like a dream? A boss that exists solely in a dream is a compelling idea, but it's also a little abstract for Dread's focus. All that to say, the good things Fusion adds to the series, the horror and suspense, are here, but I wish that was all it took. For the most part, Dread learns from Fusion's mistakes to relegate Adam to advice and prompting rather than outright dictation. The one element I was less happy to see return is the X-Parasite, or rather to return in the way that they have. The X-Parasite are floating globby blubbers, not unlike a successful experiment by the absent-minded professor. The idea of goo twirling in the air and infecting organics looks as ridiculous as it sounds, and I will die on this hill. And I hate to be the one to say it, but are they called X because when they float around they periodically extend limbs in the vague shape of an X? This is what I mean about the inherent problem with a modern visual look. You can't transfer over flying slime balls and expect to be taken seriously. It's asking too much of our human sensibilities. When it comes to art criticism, certain things get forgiven when the multitude of correct execution becomes overwhelming. Take one look at Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy for a textbook example of this. Everyone knows it doesn't follow the books as accurately as it could have. However, it captures the spirit of the books so extraordinarily well, and the heart of the films is in keeping with Tolkien's vision that all is forgiven. I don't think the X-Parasites were put under the microscope for long enough. I think they were recreated faithfully to how they appeared in Fusion, but not to the spirit of their concept. They should be terrifying, and they are nothing close to it. A common counterpoint is that this is a Nintendo game, and Nintendo has a specific brand image it needs to maintain. I understand this, but let's not forget that Metroid was derived from Ridley Scott's Alien, an R-rated film about an alien that lays eggs in humans through their mouth before they hatch by bursting out of their chests and killing them. It's the stuff of nightmares, and Metroid has always been held back from committing to these concepts fully because of its connection with Nintendo. This is why I also feel a Metroid film or an anime or a TV show is an absolutely horrible idea. We need to be able to take the world of Metroid seriously, and accounting to its own lore is a disgusting body horror fest involving enslavement, eugenics, and extinctions. But that's not how we typically think of it, because it's also a video game where gameplay and approachability take precedence. Underneath the veil, the games are very dark and serious, but we rarely get access to it because such horrors are depicted as flying wads of bubblegum. Frankly, this is the sort of stuff that makes people reluctant to take video games seriously as an art form. To be fair, the X-Parasites are not the only goofy thing in the game. Other Metroid games have their own goofy elements, and I myself am not particularly bothered by them. All the same, I think it needs to be said that this is part of a larger problem facing video games even today. They are too concerned with replicating how creatures and characters appeared on a console that could only render in 8 bits, or to the concept art that was clearly meant to be retrofit to work in a low graphics platform in which imagination would carry most of the legwork, and how serious the game's tone was. To give a comparative example, just because trees looked the way they did in 8-bit graphics does not mean you would replicate those same trees for a modern title. We have better graphical capabilities, and I would be in favor of seeing new and creative aliens in ZDR than the same simplistic aliens we've been seeing since the 80s. This isn't a major flaw, but I just don't take the X-Parasites seriously as a threat, and basically immediately seek them out as energy and missile refill pods. And I don't think a dangerous alien entity should ever fall into that type of perception. I hold this standard as less important for 2D Metroid because 2D is a limiting enough factor all on its own. The Metroid games that must be more conscientious of this are the Prime games, and for the most part, those succeed. Just as the 2D games, for the most part, succeed in the level of seriousness they also need to maintain. There are elements in Dread that push its T rating, but honestly, they just don't hit as hard as I would personally like to see. But you can't have everything. And that's not to say that the game isn't satisfying. It is. There's simply the imagination of what I think a Metroid game should look like, and sometimes that vision is worth bringing into the dialogue either to challenge the direction of the games or to invent something new entirely. At any rate, I feel similarly about the music. Music is, of course, a massive component of the atmosphere, and I am with the consensus that the music is clearly a step down. Its major flaw is that it's just not very memorable. I am hardly the first person to bring up this point, but when we compare the score with the enormous work of Kenji Yamamoto, the differences are night and day. Dread's score is much too restrained. There's a real lack of willingness to develop the music into an identity for each area. I did think Burinia fared the best, probably on account of it being among the more distinctive areas. Believe it or not, I am rather fond of some of the more ambient tracks, those found in save rooms, map stations, and transports. These tracks are moody and with just enough of a hint of zeal, such that they serve as intermediaries very well. I also found the large selection of Emmy zones to be appropriately dark and cerebral. They were the only tracks that made me feel as though I was in an otherworldly place. But the problem with the score as a whole is that it lacks identity and any kind of drive. And given everything I've already said about how the game's areas lack harsh dividing lines, coupling music into that problem, and the game has left itself wide open for criticism. Even a track like The Wrecked Ship from Super Metroid is memorable because it understands that Brinstar was energizing, while this is a dangerous and decrepit ship. I don't think it's necessary to make direct comparisons with the score from Super Metroid because it just isn't fair. There are tracks in Dread I like for the main areas, but it's very easy to turn them off because they lack that sense of focus and drive, and I just don't see any reason not to challenge the score. I'd even go so far as to say the music in Other M was better. Other M gets a bad rep, deservedly so, but I did feel the music worked well for the style of game that it was. And it definitely had some highlights that kept me interested. Honestly, I could probably throw in some Other M music, and that would probably fit better than what we got. Is it just me, or does that actually work? We've covered about all the major topics a comparison should, but there's still one untouched component that carries more weight than we might think, and that is the story. Once again, Dread proves to be a competent challenger, providing a narrative with some mystery, suspense, and a satisfying twist that makes for a dark revelation. It also mends the dire situation of Samus being part Metroid and more or less closes out the plotline for the ex-Parasite, so we can finally say good riddance to the Flubbers. There's also a personal arc of sorts since Samus confronts her Chozo lineage, even her own Chozo DNA-giving father, and we also learn about division within the Chozo race. I think the writers did a fine job of merging the game's narrative nicely with the expanded lore of the Metroid universe without having to re-explain all of that lore for us. Two subtle but strong aspects of Dread's big picture concepts is the depiction of Samus. She conducts herself like a total badass, but she isn't above compassion or understanding. Samus is just a flat-out cool and inspiring character, and seeing her lay waste to her enemies with focused professionalism really cements that identity, while adding to the action emphasis that 2D Metroid games accomplish so well. I also appreciate how you begin the game in the depths of the planet and gradually crawl upwards out of the hole until you reach this skybound environment where the truth is revealed and the elation is at its highest. I don't have any data to back this up, but I feel like anyone who started playing Metroid Dread actually finished it, in part because the quality of the game is so sharp throughout, but also because of these thoughtful trajectories and the twists and turns of the story. I also really like the sequence where Arterius is frozen over, making a revisit to the area something new and fresh and dangerous. I wanted to highlight these things that I like about the game because I've probably come across as more critical of Dread than I mean to. But like I began with, Dread is ultimately a faithful continuation of the Metroid canon, and I was more than happy both to play it and to see the warm reception that it's received. If I had to rank Metroid games, Dread would absolutely be in the top 5. It just doesn't usurp the top 2 slots. And I think at the end of the day, there are 3 elements that signify whether or not the game will be a great Metroidvania or if it will be inscripted into the Hall of Classic status. The first is atmosphere, which, as we've covered, is great but not perfect. The art and the music do leave room for alternative choices. Second is the importance on player-determined exploration. It's not necessarily about sequence breaking so much as it is the way in which the player grasps the sensation that their intuition is acknowledged and rewarded. Don't make the world feel like something the player isn't ready to approach. This is very hard to accomplish, which is why Super Metroid is basically the only video game in existence to have pulled it off, but it is a goal to strive for. But I think if you can accomplish point 3, then you can strike a claim, and other elements can be forgiven. And the third point is to have a story that invests in the grim dark and tragedy, and one that leaves the player in questioning their decisions. The part about Super Metroid that cements its status boils down to the tragic results in its ending. We don't really know our intentions for the mission when it begins, other than that the baby Metroid is too dangerous a species to leave unattended. When we actually find it, the horrors of what has happened to it call into question the trust we sometimes must place in forces other than ourselves. And then, during the climactic moment, so much is lost that it's almost as if our involvement accomplished nothing. It is a shockingly good storyline for a 16-bit game, and it's shockingly good to be told almost entirely without words. Dread understood everything about why Super Metroid is a classic, but they understood it intellectually, and it's hard to know how much emotional complexity they were able to recapture. Indeed, Super Metroid is lightning in a bottle, and being tasked to create a Picasso without having the same driving force that Picasso had, you can see where the intentionality is just different. Games can accomplish amazing experiences, and giving developers freedom and ideas to explore provides the opportunity for that lightning to be caught again. Lightning doesn't strike the same spot twice. Of course it can, and it does, but you get the sentiment. Comparing Dread to Super was never going to be fair. It actually speaks well of Dread that the comparison is worth doing in the first place. It's just that I've played it a few times now and enjoyed it every time, but I've not yet fallen in love with it, and I don't see how I could argue it as one of the greatest games of all time. But that's something I would be more than happy to do for Super Metroid. And being one of the greatest games of all time isn't really important for Dread. Dread was all about revitalizing the series, tying loose ends together, and providing a pathway forward. These are all lofty goals, but it's just a different beast when decades on end you're able to challenge our conceptions of what video games can actually accomplish. And that is something that does matter for Super Metroid. You know, on multiple occasions while I was editing this video, I reconsidered a number of points made against Dread because some of them feel a bit flimsy, even now. Complaining about the art direction, for instance, really feels like grasping at straws, but in my defense, I'm comparing 2 legendary games, so what else am I going to be doing with my time? And some things are perhaps yet to be uncovered. For example, I at first thought it was an arbitrary homage to Mother Brain to incorporate the brain AIs that control the Emmys. However, these are part of the Metroid canon, and they are utilized by the Federation, which we've seen in the comics, and as the Aurora units, which are essentially AI organic supercomputers in Metroid Prime 3. It was a nice touch. And Dread is packed full of them. It's difficult to articulate accurately and fairly what it is that separates these two, which is why it's taken so long for me to even finish this video. I wanted to get it right. And I didn't want nostalgia to be a factor, which meant replaying both games numerous times. And I think Super Metroid somehow always manages to surprise me with every playthrough. I always seem to reach a point where I'm uncertain where I need to go next, but can stumble into a myriad of roads that all lead to the same pulse-pounding finale. By contrast, the possibilities in Dread feel so much more limited. Not as bad as Fusion, but it is noticeable. And the gut punch ending of Super Metroid cannot be understated either. The loss, the sensation that all your efforts may have been not only for nothing, but actually a dark inversion, that's the kind of stuff of greats. In the case of Super Metroid, it's a grim, dark tale where the best of intentions ultimately provide the exact conditions for evil to flourish. If Samus had done her job and killed the baby Metroid from the start, no one on Station Ceres would have died, and the Metroid would not have been tortured for its entire life. A planet with all of its life forms would still exist. It was Samus's conscience that got in the way. That single deviation from the plan that spurred everything else into motion. That is why Metroid actually represents isolation and loneliness. It isn't solely that you are alone on the planet, but that the galaxy is filled with cruel beings on both sides, and your better nature can and will be used against you. I think in Dread, you're more concerned with survival, and maybe that isn't as instinctively rewarding, for me at least. I think I am compelled by an idea that has more to do with personal sacrifice than escaping the jaws of death. Yes, Ravenbeak's treachery is an interesting twist. Samus, and by extension the player, is towing the line of humanity, but I don't know that Samus or the player is really changed by the end of it. Maybe in Super Metroid, the price that is paid is not personal, but rather about something larger than ourselves. The survival of our young are more important to us. Even though the Metroid is not actually Samus's offspring, it does play with this idea that we are responsible for the baby. It has nowhere else to go. It is completely vulnerable and therefore innocent, and that makes it all the more heart-wrenching to see it brutally murdered in the end. Dread has its strengths, not the least of which is its grounded perspective. It took a fine-toothed comb through all things Metroid and reinvigorated the series with new life, and for that I'll always be grateful. At the same time, there is a real power to Super Metroid that touches a deeper part of our humanity. So, while Dread marks a crucial upswing in Metroid relevance, the artistic and design influence of Super Metroid will outlive Dread in the